Alvin Thomas walked onto a Midwestern golf course, bet the club champion he could beat him playing left-handed, and walked off with $500 cash. That was 1924. He never once punched a clock. What did he know that the rest of America had already forgotten? Here is what most people get wrong about 1920s America. The 9-to-5 factory job was not the default. It was the newcomer. For most working Americans in 1920, income came from a patchwork of small hustles, neighborhood trades, and cash-in-hand arrangements that had nothing to do with a single employer. The formal wage economy was still being built, and the people living through that transition had no choice but to be resourceful. They did not have apps. They had resourcefulness. The first hustle on this list is the prop bed, and Titanic Thompson was its undisputed master. Alvin Thomas built his entire livelihood around engineering situations where he could not lose. He would spend weeks practicing a skill in secret, then wager on it publicly as if it were a long shot. He once bet a group of men he could throw a walnut over a building, then loaded the walnut with lead shot before the toss. In 1920s terms, he was not cheating. He was offering a service, the thrill of the bet. The lesson is the setup, not the swindle. Ice delivery was one of the most reliable cash-in-hand trades of the era, and it required almost no startup capital beyond a strong back and a second-hand wagon. Before mechanical refrigeration became widespread in American homes, the Iceman was not optional. He was infrastructure. Routes were owned by the driver, not a company. A good route in a mid-sized city could service 40 to 60 homes daily and generate steady weekly income that rivaled a factory floor supervisor. The route itself became an asset you could sell. Knife sharpening was a walk-up business that required one piece of equipment and zero overhead. Men pushed grinding wheels mounted on wooden carts through neighborhoods, calling out as they went. Housewives and cooks were their core customers, and a skilled sharpener could work a single block of homes in under an hour and move on. The key insight here is that the service was invisible until it was needed, and then it was urgently needed. Word of mouth did the advertising. No flyers, no fees, no middleman. Ragpicking sounds like desperation, but it was actually a functioning supply chain hustle. Ragpickers collected discarded cloth, paper, metal, and glass from streets and back alleys, then sold the sorted materials to brokers who resupplied manufacturers. A disciplined ragpicker in a dense urban neighborhood could sort and sell multiple categories of material in a single day. The income was real, and the startup cost was a sack. In cities like Chicago and New York, established ragpickers owned their territory the same way a delivery driver owns a route today. The boarding house was the original real estate hustle, and women ran most of them. A widow or a single woman with a large home could take in 2 to 4 boarders, charge weekly rent, and include meals as an upsell. The margins were thin, but the cash was reliable, and it came in every Friday. In 1920, an estimated 1 in 5 urban American households either took in boarders or lived as boarders themselves. The hustle required no license, no loan, and no landlord approval. You own the asset, you monetize the rooms. Bootlegging is the obvious one, but most people picture the big operators. The real money for ordinary people was in the small-scale neighborhood supply chain. A woman in a Chicago tenement could brew a batch of home beer, sell it by the glass to neighbors, and clear more in a weekend than a week of factory work. The risk was real, but so was the demand. Prohibition ran from 1920 to 1933, and during those 13 years an entire underground economy of small producers, runners, and distributors operated in plain sight of their own communities. The numbers runner was a fixture of working-class urban neighborhoods from Harlem to Detroit. The job was simple: collect small bets from neighbors on a daily lottery-style number, deliver the money up the chain, and pay out winners. The runner kept a percentage of every bet collected. A reliable runner with a good territory could work a 2-hour morning route and generate daily cash income without ever touching a factory floor. It was informal, it was illegal, but it was also a functioning commission-based sales job a century before gig apps existed. Peddling from a cart or a basket was a legitimate licensed trade in most American cities in the 1920s, and it was one of the most accessible entry points into commerce for immigrants and working-class men and women. The model was straightforward: buy produce, dry goods, or notions wholesale, sell retail on a route, keep the margin. The best peddlers built loyal repeat customers on specific streets and days. Some of those peddlers eventually opened storefronts. The cart was not the end goal. It was the seed capital and the proof of concept. Shoe shining was not a corner novelty. In 1920s America, it was a structured small business with real territorial logic. A good stand in a train station, hotel lobby, or downtown corner could serve 30 to 50 customers on a weekday. The men who owned the best spots guarded them, and sometimes paid informal fees to building managers to keep their placement. Equipment cost was low, turnover was daily, and tips were a meaningful percentage of income. Some operators ran multiple chairs and hired workers, turning a one-man hustle into a small employer. Laundry taking in was one of the most common female-run side hustles of the era, and it operated entirely on word of mouth and neighborhood trust. A woman with a wash tub, a wringer, and a clothesline could take in laundry from bachelor tenants, small businesses, or nearby hotels and generate weekly cash income without leaving her home. The work was physically demanding, but the economics were sound: low overhead, repeat customers, and a service that was genuinely difficult to replace. Some women in dense urban blocks ran informal laundry operations, serving a dozen regular accounts. Caddying sounds like a teenager's summer job, but in 1920s America the golf boom created a genuine adult income stream for men who understood the game and could read a course. Caddies earned a base fee plus tips, and a skilled caddy who could give useful yardage advice and club recommendations commanded premium rates. The golf industry was expanding rapidly in the 20s, with hundreds of new courses opening across the country. A caddy who worked multiple rounds on a Saturday at a busy club could earn in a day what a factory worker earned in a week. Freelance photography was a real hustle in the 1920s for anyone who could afford a camera and learn the basics of developing. Portrait photography was in high demand from families who wanted documentation of weddings, new babies, and military departures. A photographer who owned his equipment and worked on commission from a local newspaper or sold portraits directly could build a client list entirely through word of mouth. The barrier to entry was the equipment cost, but once that was cleared, the margin on a single portrait session was significant relative to factory wages. Hauling and cartage was the gig economy of the 1920s. A man with a horse and wagon, or later a used Model T truck, could hire himself out for moving furniture, delivering coal, hauling construction debris, or transporting goods for small merchants. The work was irregular, but the demand was constant in any growing city. The asset was the vehicle. The business was the relationship with repeat customers. A reliable hauler with a good reputation in a single neighborhood could stay booked without ever advertising, because the word of mouth moved faster than any flyer. Barbering without a shop was a legitimate neighborhood hustle. A man with a good pair of shears, a straight razor, and a steady hand could cut hair in kitchens, on back porches, or in rented chairs inside existing barbershops on a commission basis. In black neighborhoods during the 1920s, the neighborhood barber who worked out of his home was often a community anchor, and the income was reliable because haircuts are not optional. The hustle scaled naturally: build a loyal client base, then eventually open a chair or a shop. This one got buried, but it never stopped working. Selling homemade food from the doorstep or at a local market was a hustle that required no license in most jurisdictions in the 1920s and no commercial kitchen. Women who could bake pies, bread, or prepared meals sold directly to neighbors, to local lunch counters, or to workers at nearby factories and construction sites. The markup on homemade baked goods over raw ingredient cost was substantial. A woman who baked 12 pies on a Friday and sold them by Saturday morning was running a real margin business, not a charity. The customers came back because the product was consistent. Scrap metal dealing was a structured hustle with real market pricing behind it. The scrap yards that operated in every American city in the 1920s paid cash for iron, copper, brass, and lead by the pound. A man with a wagon and a knowledge of where discarded metal accumulated, whether at construction sites, behind machine shops, or in vacant lots, could fill a load and sell it same day. The key was knowing the yards and knowing the prices. It was commodity trading at street level, and the men who worked it consistently treated it like a business, not a last resort. Envelope stuffing and clerical piecework was a real income source in the 1920s, not the scam it became in later decades. Publishers, mail-order companies, and political campaigns hired workers to stuff, address, and seal large mailings at a per-piece rate. Women and older workers who could not take physical jobs could take home bundles of envelopes and earn cash by the thousand. The work was tedious, but the math was honest. A fast worker who treated it like a production line rather than a casual task could generate meaningful supplemental income on a consistent weekly basis. Tutoring and music lessons were the side hustle of the educated working class. A woman who played piano, a man who had completed some schooling, or anyone with a demonstrable skill in arithmetic, grammar, or a foreign language could charge by the hour for private instruction. In immigrant neighborhoods, English tutoring was in constant demand. In middle-class areas, piano lessons were a status purchase for families who wanted their children to advance. The work happened in living rooms and parlors, required no advertising beyond a handwritten card in a window, and paid in cash at the end of every session. Gambling stake management was Titanic Thompson's most sophisticated move, and it is the one most people overlook. He did not just bet. He managed his bankroll the way a modern trader manages risk. He never bet money he could not afford to lose on a single proposition. He diversified across games and sports, and he always had a backup hustle running. The system is what separated him from the men who lost everything at the same tables. Your grandparents already solved this problem. We just stopped listening. The hustle was never the bet. The hustle was the discipline behind it. Flipping used goods was not called flipping in 1920, but the mechanics were identical. Men and women who attended estate sales, farm auctions, and junk shops bought underpriced items and resold them at a markup through newspaper classifieds, word of mouth, or informal street markets. The skill was in knowing what something was worth before the seller did. Furniture, tools, clothing, and books all moved through this informal secondary market. The people who did it consistently were not lucky. They were educated about value in a specific category, and they worked that knowledge repeatedly. Here is the thread that runs through all 20 of these hustles. None of them required a degree. None required a startup loan. None required permission from an employer, a platform, or an algorithm. They required observation, consistency, and the willingness to do something that most people around you were too comfortable or too proud to try. The men and women running these hustles in 1920 were not desperate. They were strategic. They looked at what their neighborhood needed, and they showed up to provide it, every single day, for cash in hand. If you are watching this on a lunch break or a Sunday evening wondering whether any of this actually applies to your life right now, the answer is yes. The specific trades have changed, but the underlying logic has not. Find what your neighborhood needs that nobody is reliably providing. Learn it well enough to do it consistently. Build the word-of-mouth reputation before you worry about the scale. Pick one thing from this list that you could actually test this month, not someday, this month, and start there. Old hustle, new money. That is the whole idea. If you want more of these, the next video is already waiting for you.